All right. Welcome, everybody, to Finance Essentials with Danny Hudson. I am your host, Danny Hudson, and we're here for another great episode. I believe this is episode 30, which, as far as podcasts go, is a pretty good milestone. I think I read somewhere that the average podcast goes for like 7 episodes, which I understand. A lot of times people get like 6 or 7 episodes in, they're like, what the hell am I supposed to do now? What am I supposed to talk about? But the good news of a current event and economics slash finance podcast is that there's always something in the news, right? And you always get people that are requesting new topics or that they want you to dive into, which I always appreciate because it helps me kind of learn about some new stuff. But anyway, here we are. So episode 30. First off, let me thank everybody for tuning in. If you're new to the show, I appreciate you being here. If you're a veteran of the show, I appreciate you too, but, sometimes we like the new people a little bit more. But yeah, so welcome everybody for listening. If you can, do us a favor, share the show to whoever if you get some good value out of it. And don't forget to follow us on social media. We're on and available on all podcast platforms as well as social media platforms. So do all of that fun stuff. So like I mentioned, episode 30. This episode is actually coming from several listeners. Some folks had actually requested this episode, and I apologize. It's finally it's taken so long to get around to discussing it. But I think it was a good time to do so because a fun article. Well, I don't know. Your definition of fun might be a little bit different than mine. But an article did pop up that was kind of related to it, and I thought that now would be a really good time to dive into the housing market. Right? We all love talking about the housing market, but before we do that, just to give you guys a heads up, there's a few things that are obviously going on in the news these days that are kind of on the radar for most people. The George Floyd case was settled. I believe Chauvin was the cop's name. I believe he was found guilty on all counts. And then also too, we now have governors across the U.S. I believe Michigan and Oregon are the first two that are looking at instituting their emergency COVID powers as permanent. Which I don't think if you're a regular listener to this show, that comes as much of a surprise, but that's also a thing. In cryptocurrencies, the crypto market has been down a little bit over the last few days, but as you guys know, if you follow along with that market, it fluctuates and it tends to be quite volatile. But that's going on. But anyway, so back to the housing issue, right? There was an article that came across my computer the other day, and I thought it was pretty funny. But what it was breaking down the fact that housing supply is in such a short supply that there are now more registered realtor agents or realtors, I guess, than there were actually homes available for sale. So think about it like this. According to this, there were at the end of January 2021, there were 1.04 million homes for sale. Now you're probably thinking, wow, that's over 1 million houses for sale. That's pretty good. But when you think about it, right, there's also 330 million people that live in this country. So 1 million houses for sale is not really a lot. But also to add some additional perspective, that was the lowest that it's been in 40 years. But also, too, according to the National Association of Realtors, there's about 1.45 million, recognized realtors in the U.S., which is actually about 5% more than last year. And then the supply of houses is actually down 26% from 2019. So if you think about it, there's about 40% more agents trying to sell a house or to buy a house, I guess, than there are actual houses in the inventory. And so you're probably thinking, you're like, all right, now that's pretty wild. Why is that happening? What is the reason behind the fact that houses are in such short supply? And as a result, as I'm sure a lot of you have been finding out, is that the prices themselves are essentially skyrocketing. I mean, skyrocketing is probably a relative term depending upon where you live. If you're anything like me, once or twice a year, you probably look at the current value of your home, just to kind of see what type of equity that you may have in there. Now, a lot of times people are going to look at that and they're going to go, oh man, this is great. My house is appreciated 10% or whatever it might be over the last year. But the thing that you're not thinking about is while your house is also appreciating 10%, other houses are also appreciating 10%. Now, again, depending upon where you live. But what that means is that you can sit there and you can think, hey, we should sell our house and buy a new house. Well, the problem that you're going to encounter is that as your house is appreciating and other houses are also appreciating, that it's not actually helping you because all of the other houses are also getting more expensive. The one exception to that would be is if you plan to move to a lower cost of living area, right? And if you live outside of California, if you live outside of New York, if you live outside of Massachusetts, outside of Illinois, places like that are kind of seeing mass immigration and people leaving those states, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because, for example, we were looking at purchasing some land in East Tennessee this past weekend. And sure enough, the houses that are being sold and being bought up are people who are relocating from places like California. So in California, take the Bay Area, for example, where the average home price is something insane like $700,000 or $800,000, and they're like, well, I don't need to live here anymore. I can move. I can work remote, whatever it might be. I'm going to sell my house here for $700,000, $800,000. And then you find out you could buy half of the state of Arkansas for $800,000. So, it's one of those things where if you live in an area where there are a lot of people who are moving to, then you kind of see this firsthand. And so if you're one of those people who is wanting to stay maybe in your local area, maybe you like your community, whatever it might be, you are seeing houses that you might consider purchasing rising at the same rate as the home that you're currently in. Now, if you're planning on staying in it for a while, you're thinking, all right, well, we're not planning on going anywhere. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But what it's doing is it's kind of blocking out people who are looking at purchasing, right? First-time home buyers or whoever that might be. And so at this point, you're probably asking yourself, well, why? Why is that? Why are home prices shooting up so much over, the last year and a half? Technically, it's been longer than that, but in particularly over the last shorter period of time. Part of it has to do with raw material costs, right? If you guys have been paying attention at all as far as the news goes, you may realize that lumber has absolutely skyrocketed in terms of price. So to give you a little bit of an idea, April 16th, 2021, the futures contract for every delivery month in 2021 were over $1,000 per board foot. Now, board foot is a calculation based off of volume. So if you think about it, right, it's a supply of wood is over $1,000. And the spot price for May 2021 was almost $1,300. Now you might be saying, well, that's not very relevant for me because I don't know what that means. But to give you an idea, in April of last year, which was in 2020, the actual contract was trading at about $350. So in essentially a year, you've gone from $350 all the way up to $1,300. And to give you an idea of what exactly that means, I have a friend of mine who was in the process of purchasing and building a home in a different state. Well, because of these prices and labor increases, the cost of him being able to build his home increased by about $50,000. $50,000 because of the increase in lumber. Part of this is because of all of the cheap money that we have talked about in episodes past that is continuingly to be pumped into the system, right? Money that's essentially created out of thin air, we're talking in the neighborhood of $6 to $8 trillion, is starting to permeate through the economy, and it's starting to have impacts. Another part of it is that if you remember, if you were around back in 2007, 2008, when there was a big housing crisis, a lot of builders, a lot of contractors, a lot of suppliers, a lot of manufacturers ended up kind of getting the short end of the stick. So you also have a lot of these lumber manufacturers who unfortunately are a little hesitant in terms of trying to increase production. Because if you think about it in the sense of a bubble, the last thing that you would want to do as a lumber manufacturer is spend 20, 30, 40 million dollars to increase your production capacity, only to have the housing market collapse again and you not be able to produce the amount of lumber to be able to make that investment worth it. So there was also some hesitancy there on the lumber side. But one of the things that we like to do on this show is we also like to look at it from a historical aspect, right? Most of us, again, we have not been around, we have not been purchasing houses over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 decades, but it is important to understand when we're talking about pumping in trillions of dollars into the system, which essentially would create inflation. What has the housing prices looked like over the last several decades? So, for example, if you look at the BLS, which is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, prices for houses were up almost 800% in 2021 versus 1967. So between 1967 and 2021, housing was experiencing an approximate inflation every year of about 4.1%. And so what that's doing is it's basically saying we're seeing housing inflation every year of about 4.1%. So to give you an idea, a house that cost $100,000 in 1967 would cost almost $900,000 today for an equivalent purchase. And so the comparative inflation rate versus the dollar was about 3.9%. So I believe the bulk of this actually happened in the 70s and 80s, where the US actually saw pretty considerable amount of inflation. I think it was around 10-ish%. I don't remember the specifics as far as the years go. The way they track it has decreased some since then. What I mean by the way that they track it is that I believe personally that real inflation is higher than kind of what the Fed claims as inflation. And so they'll say that inflation is 2% or 3% or something along those lines, whereas I believe real inflation would actually be a bit higher than that. Based off of the BLS calculation, you can kind of see that we're talking about a difference of about a quarter of a percent. But a quarter of a percent from the standard inflation up to the housing inflation can be pretty considerable when you're talking about time frames and time spans of over decades. So that's part of it, right? We're seeing housing inflation over the years, and we'll get into a little bit more details as far as what some of the additional factors are in that. But again, the continual printing of dollars is a primary driver. If you pay attention to Jerome Powell or Janet Yellen, they will typically tend to refer to deflation as kind of an enemy of progress. And the reason for that is because they like to inflate and essentially devalue the currency, because what it does is it makes the outstanding debts less valuable, right? That's kind of an easy way for them to be able to make up for not being able to afford current debts by being able to kind of inflate it away. So if I owe you $100 from 10 years ago, that's going to be a lot more valuable than if I owe you $100 from right now. And so they'll talk about, how deflation is kind of the enemy. Again, that would be something that's saved for a different time. But what it does, though, is it leads into another aspect of what's going on in the housing market. And it's the fact that corporations and large companies are also purchasing single-family homes. And so, for example, Cerberus is one, and what they're calling themselves is a single-family rental business. So they're going around and they're buying up millions and billions of dollars worth of homes. So Cerberus is one, Invitation Homes is one, American Homes for Rent is one. And so they're buying up tens of thousands of homes across the US with the intentions of essentially renting those out. Now, you might be thinking, well, why would anybody do that? Or maybe you're not thinking that, but I'm going to explain it anyway. Part of it is because that is one of the best returns that they're going to be able to get on their money. If you have money in a checking account or in a savings account, because of the prime rates, right? The interest rates, they're non-existent. They're not there. I mean, you might get 0.01%, maybe 0.1% on your money. The current stock market is at all-time highs. We're printing up trillions of dollars worth of monetary supply. So where are these companies going to go to be able to get a return on their investment for their shareholders, for themselves? Well, they're going to get into housing. Why not? Because we just talked about that housing will generally, depending upon your area and region and that kind of thing, outpace the rate of inflation. And so if I can sit there and I can buy a home that will appreciate at, and again, a lot of this is related to inflation, if I know that it's going to go up 4%, whereas the advertised inflation rate is 3%, and I can get someone to rent it for more than what I owe on it every month, why wouldn't I do that? I mean, it makes perfect sense. Now, again, the drawback though is that you and I, we don't have a bank account with $50 billion in it. We can't just go in and go, how much do you want for that house? $500,000. Let me plug it into my calculator here. Okay, that makes sense. Here's a check for $500,000. What we're doing is we're going, well, we'd really like to buy your home, but we need to sell our house first, and then we need to secure financing, and we can only put down 5%, whatever those conditions might be. If you're a seller and you're like, wait a minute, I don't have to go through this process. I can have somebody give me what I want or a little bit more in cash. Yeah, let's just do that. That makes perfect sense to me. And so what you're finding is that you're finding these large companies are going in and they're buying up a lot of these properties and renting them, and it's leaving people who are trying to buy a home kind of out in the dark, and there's not much that they can do. But again, part of it has to do with the fact is that they want to get a return on their money, and a lot of your traditional avenues is just not affording anyone to be able to do so. So people will continue to kind of take riskier and riskier investments to try and stay ahead of the inflation game and get a return on that money. And another part of it that you're also experiencing, if you have refinanced or you've purchased a home over the last several years, is record low interest rates. So essentially an interest rate is what the Fed is loaning out its money at. And then generally those interest rates will be relative versus what they are loaning it out to us as consumers, right? So as an example, in September of 2020, the interest rates for mortgages came in at about 3%. I believe it was a little lower than that. It was probably about 2.9%. And so people like myself and my family, we had originally purchased our current home. I believe it was at like 4.25%. And so what we ended up doing is over the span of a couple of years, because the interest rates kept dropping, we just went ahead and we just refinanced. And so a lot of other people who are seeing these low interest rates are thinking, well, we weren't planning on buying a home currently. We were going to wait a little while. But we need to go ahead and pull the trigger on that now because interest rates are so low. And if you think about it, a 0.5% in terms of an interest rate over the span of a 30-year mortgage can make a pretty considerable amount, which, by the way, as a side note, if you have the means to, and this is just from my own experience and my own knowledge, if you have the means to pay extra. So even if you make one extra mortgage payment a year, say your mortgage is $1,000, which, oh man, yeah, that would be nice if our mortgage is only $1,000. But say your mortgage is $1,000, and every month you put a little bit of additional towards principal, or maybe whenever you get a bonus at work or your tax return or whatever, you make an additional principal only mortgage payment. Over the life of that 30 years, you are going to reduce down the amount that you owe by a pretty considerable amount. And so if that's something that you've been considering or something that you've been discussing with your husband or your wife, that's something worth looking into if you have the means to. A lot of people also opt for 15-year mortgages as opposed to 30. Also doable. Generally, your interest rate is going to be a bit lower. My only concern, again, this is from personal experience, is that if you lock in the 15-year mortgage, you're kind of obligated to that monthly payment, right? Where if something was to happen career-wise, job-wise, whatever it might be, you don't really have the option to pay less. Whereas if you have a 30-year, you can pay more, and then if something does happen, then at least you can reduce down to meet your minimal obligation until your situation improves again, and then you can kind of start making additional principal. So super low interest rates are driving people to the market to be able to take out loans. And some people are also kind of wondering, well, what drives the interest rates whenever you're going to look at a mortgage? A lot of people will tend to look at like the 10-year treasury. The 10-year treasury is not generally going to give you a good indicator in terms of what mortgage rates are doing. What you're generally going to want to look for is like the bonds impact. So mortgage bonds or mortgage-backed securities. Think what your kind of Fannie Mae Mae and Freddie Macs do. They kind of take a lot of those loans, they bundle them together, and then they sell them off as mortgage-backed securities. If you ever want to watch The Big Short, I definitely recommend it. It's very enjoyable. It's enjoyable, but it's also a bit depressing, and it'll also make you super angry to watch and kind of see how some of the system works. It doesn't quite work that way anymore, but it's still going to make you very, very angry. But that's kind of what they do. And so those are generally going to be what you want to look at. Another idea is, and this is something I was guilty of, is you look at Fed rate cuts, right? So very little opportunity for the Fed to increase rates, but they have been known to, especially in recent days, decrease rates. So people will look at rate cuts and they try to predict as far as where the Fed rate cuts are coming in. The only issue that you're going to find a lot of times with that is that when the Fed does cut its rate, sometimes what will happen immediately is you'll actually see a spike in mortgage rates, and part of it is because people are coming in and they're refinancing, and so these companies are able to put a little bit of an additional premium on top because you have an urgency, right? So you're a bit more urgent in terms of trying to refinance your mortgage, and so therefore they can get a little bit more out of you. But over time, it will kind of drop off and level off based off of how they're dictating it. So your super low interest rates is another driver that's really kind of helping to spur the housing market. And another thing to consider is that all of this is going on during a time with a lot of financial insecurity, right? I mean, over the span of the last year or so, due to lockdowns, hundreds of thousands of businesses have been shuttered. Millions of people have lost their jobs or they have reduced wages due to lockdown impacts, things along those lines. So if you ask most people who are very familiar with the economy, most people aren't going to be able to give you, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I would fall into this camp. Most people are going to not be able to give you a very good explanation of where we are actually going to be going. So there's a lot of uncertainty that's going on. And while all of this uncertainty is going on, these housing prices are continuing to continue to skyrocket, which isn't something that most people would normally see. But again, when you factor in things like inflation and the interest rates and things, it does start to kind of clear up and make a bit more sense. The other one, and if you're a regular listener to the show, this is not going to come as a surprise, especially if you're very familiar with me. But another big indicator that's going on as far as the housing market goes is red tape, right? Think government bureaucracy, government red tape that essentially restricts a lot of house building. I'm thinking I'm going to do another episode on rent control in the future and why rent control is bad. I guess surprise. I guess maybe I didn't need to spoil it. But I'm thinking I'm going to do another episode on rent control. But if you think about the government bureaucracy and the government red tape, that also tends to be a pretty big driving force, because when you think about when someone goes to build a home, you're not just talking about the land, you're not talking about the materials, you're not talking about the labor, but there's also permits, there's also restrictions, there's also certifications. All of these things are going to add in additional cost to the home. Now, if you have bought a home over the last several years, one of the things that you've probably noticed, especially if you didn't own a home prior, is that there's not really a lot of starter homes anymore. A starter home in the past was generally described as, you get married, you want to have a family or something along those lines, but you want to go from renting over to owning a home. You don't have a lot of money for a down payment, you don't have a lot of capital, but you want to buy a home, and that way you can start putting it into a home, you can start building some equity, and then as you get a family or whatever it might be, eventually you decide you get to the point where you want to own a larger home, and then you use the equity that you built up in that home to be able to apply to your new one and then kind of upgrade from there. But a lot of times starter homes these days don't really exist. A lot of places they don't, and the reason for it is because they're just not profitable. They're not profitable because the costs to actually build homes, especially newer ones, is just not there. So to give you a bit of an idea, the average cost to build a single family home in the US is about $300,000, and that is excluding the lot, that's excluding driveway, landscaping, so on and so forth. But then if you think about it, you add those things on it, and you're probably closer to $400,000. And if you're in the market for a starter home, $400,000 is probably not the budget and that you're looking for. So what you're going to end up finding out is that there's going to be very few neighborhoods of new construction that most people would typically define as kind of a starter home. So your starter homes nowadays are going to be what people would refer to as a fixer-upper, right? You're going to need to fix it up, or you're going to need to put some elbow grease in it because the roof needs some repairs, or there was some water damage, or whatever it might be. So now what people are looking at as far as starter homes go are older homes that are going to need some work done. And again, and it's because a lot of times building these homes is not profitable. And so if I was a contractor, and if I was building homes, if the starting point of putting in a home is $400,000, well, now I'm in a segment of the market where I need to understand, who am I targeting? Because if the starting home construction cost is going to be $400,000, maybe there's more people in the market for something that's $500,000. And at that point, then I can actually get a little bit more of a return on my building, rather than go ahead and starting at the bottom of the market, when if you can afford a 400, maybe they can afford a 450 or whatever it might be. And so therefore they're going to go ahead and build whatever the maximum that they think that they can get the maximum return on the construction of those homes. So the easiest way, I think, to be able to look at it when I'm describing something like government red tape is to use a specific example. And so, yeah, lucky me, it was easy to find. So there is a place in Minnesota. So if you guys are familiar with Minnesota and Wisconsin, they're both Midwestern states, up, getting relatively close to Canada, but up near the Dakotas and that kind of thing. But they're neighbors. And so the article that I actually found that has a perfect example in it is from Lake Elmo, Minnesota. Lake Elmo, Minnesota is a tiny little town on the border. I guess it's not that tiny. I think there's like 10,000 people that live there. Well, maybe that's pretty tiny. But it's right across the border from a town called Hudson, Wisconsin, which again, I'm kind of impartial to that because I think the name is great. I'm not going to move to Wisconsin, but I appreciate the fact that they named a town after me. That makes me feel good. A little bit of a boost to the ego. But in 2019, they had a report from Minnesota where they were interviewing a builder that actually built homes in that area. And so he did a lot of work across multiple Midwest states and so on and so forth. But what he said is that Minnesota's bureaucracy adds an additional approximately 15% onto the home price. So if you go to buy a home, it's going to cost you 15% more in Minnesota than it would in Wisconsin. And I mean, we're literally talking about miles, right? We're talking about a few miles apart. Is 15%. And so one of the examples is that he was saying, for me to build the exact same home in Minnesota as opposed to Wisconsin, again, keep in mind these are just several miles apart, is $60,000. It will cost him $60,000 more to build a home in Minnesota than it would in Wisconsin, even though they're just a few miles apart, which I thought was absolutely astounding. And if I was an elected official in Minnesota, I would be thinking, what is going on? How are we doing this? All of the people that we would want to live in Minnesota are just going to live in Wisconsin because that's what makes sense. And so what he was saying was he kind of gave it a little bit of a further breakdown. There was a single permit, for example, in Minnesota that's $8,000 more in Minnesota than it is in Wisconsin. And he was saying, too, that again, when we're talking about red tape, that he would generally have to deal with 6 to 8 different bureaucracies in Minnesota than he would if he had to do it in Wisconsin. And so that's going to be another factor. I'm sure a lot of you, especially if you listen to the episode that we did on the infrastructure, is that when you go to very heavy regulation states, places like your Californias, in this example, like your Minnesotas, like your Illinois, like your Washingtons, your Massachusetts, I could keep naming these names off, but that's also going to be a significant driving factor. And so if you think about the fact that it's going to cost me $60,000 more to build a house in Minnesota than it would a few miles away in Wisconsin, that's money that I'm going to have to recoup, or you're going to have to recoup. And so that's going to be added on to the cost of the home, which just means that that's just going to get passed down the line. So all those people who would normally like to be able to buy a home are now unable to do so because of that. And so what I wanted to do is really give a pretty good breakdown as far as what is helping to drive some of these increased costs that we're seeing in the housing market. And you can see it's not just one or two things, it's a real big compilation of multiple things. But I think that it's very important to understand of what's going on in the housing market, especially if you're in the neighborhood of trying to purchase a home, because things like that are very important to be aware of. And it's important that you understand what's going on because, again, as we're talking about financial freedom and really being able to escape and do what you need to do or leave where you need to leave or whatever you need to do to achieve the level of freedom that you deserve, these are the types of things that you want to make sure that you're aware of. But I hope you guys enjoyed that show. If you have any questions or feedback, by all means, let me know. If you do get some good value out of it, like I said, share the show. Maybe you've got somebody who's really pissed off because they're trying to buy a home and they can't. And now you can send them over the show and you can say, well, this is why you can't afford to buy a house because of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, that kind of thing. But I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, let me know, and we'll talk to you again soon. All right, bye.